Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hey, I'm Jesse, and you're listening to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
Today we are leaning into a topic that we've been hoping to do for a long time that was a listener question and other folks have expressed a lot of interest in decolonizing therapy. We're going to talk about what it is and some of our ideas around how to approach it.
This has been a really important topic ever since we got a listener question in season two. It's one of those topics that we couldn't just churn out our ideas on it. Mostly because Ryan and I both recognize that we come from a white privileged position, even though we hold decolonized positions in other ways, and with our sexuality, gender expression. We really wanted to do this topic justice, that we would take the time, read the books, ask questions, and really engage with this topic. So it's been something that's been on our minds since season two, but not something we've really felt ready to dive into until now. With that in mind, we thought, let's decolonize a little bit of this episode in the sense of grabbing some voices that sometimes feel on the margins, having them say whatever they wanted to. No constructs on like what they were going to talk about, but simply if you wanted to say something about this topic, we will read it exactly in your words. And this could be your chance to shine. And so you're going to hear other people's voices that we'll read their quotes from throughout this episode as well.
We also both kind of started the development of this podcast by reading some of the book Decolonizing Therapy by Mullen. So that has also influenced that you'll hear quotes from that book, as well as us kind of using her ideas as a springboard.
Hmm.
So we just kind of want to start without assuming that everyone knows what decolonizing or even colonizing is. So we want to just start with the definition and what it has to do with therapy.
Yeah, Mullen actually has a great quote. So I'm going to read this, and this would be very much what this idea of colonization would be, and how it impacts everyone. She says that one definition is the systematic and methodical removal of land, culture, trust in self and others, family, history, freedom, and spirit, religion, or any form of worship and honoring. Colonial occupation and invasion have been and continue to be enough to erode the foundations of many a thriving Indigenous society. And that's from page 43 of her book, Decolonizing Therapy. And I thought that that was an excellent way of capturing everything that's taken away when somebody enters a land and really decides to make it their own.
Absolutely. And some of those, make it really clear how the underpinnings of colonization and its occurrence really unavoidably create psychological and spiritual trauma on just a fundamental and deep level. I mean, a lot of the things you heard there are just basic parts of identity and knowledge of yourself and your culture, and a lot of loss of traditions, spiritual traditions and other traditions. Um, so it's important to kind of keep in mind that, especially when we're working in the Western world, and really every place in the world has been touched by colonization,
Yes.
that we are going to be confronting the impact of that. And if we don't think we are, it's because we and the other person in the room are probably sitting in more privilege than we realize we are. Um, and one thing that I think Jesse and I both found like hit home the level of ongoing impact that colonization has had on the world is this other quote from Mullen's book that's just the fact that there are 61 colonies and territories in the world right now, or as of the writing of the book at least. Australia having six, Denmark having two, the Netherlands having two, France having 16, New Zealand having three, Norway having three, the United Kingdom's having 15, the United States having 14. This is not over. This is not just a history lesson.
Even within Canada, where I am in Toronto, the impacts of the Indigenous communities that have been removed from families and homes, have had their culture stripped to have more of a white man, very much British understanding of education, Christian kind of ideologies pushed upon them. It's still something that they're trying to reclaim. There was an incredible book that came out through the Truth and Reconciliation Project that I did take time to read in 2015. It's harrowing, incredibly insightful and well written, and is important to show how the very land that I live on is not my own. And a lot of Canadians that are from Europe originally, our ancestors, we know that we're settlers. And to read a book like that, it really hammers home how.
Hmm. What's the book?
The Truth and Reconciliation Project did a full book, 500 pages, on the history of what colonization looked like in Canada. They really looked into the residential schools specifically
Hmm.
and the removal of children from their homes, put into these very violent, both physically, sexually, mentally, spiritually, schools that would try to strip the Indigenous out of the children.
Yes, there were residential schools in the United States as well, as I believe many other places, but North America was where many of them kind of took root of this habit to completely erase and forcibly like kind of indoctrinate people from childhood, so there was less resistance. And that by itself is, incredibly violent and abusive. And we find historically that also physical, sexual, and emotional abuse beyond that colonization on an individual level happened over and over again. Um, so I think it's really important to recognize that like the impact of colonization is individual as well as community based as well as global. And it touches everyone. I think that's something I really want us to avoid is thinking that colonization and decolonization are about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and
Mm,
people of color exclusively. This is also very much about white people and what they've done and how that's also negatively impacted everyone. No one is really free of the negative impacts of colonization, although many groups are suffering it, far more. And really, the whole kind of quote project, the whole regime of colonization, um, was started by white men, white European men, who, when they found a place that wasn't populated by other white European people, they kind of thought like, okay, this is mine for the taking by force, and I can have this. I can extract the resources. I can enslave the people. And there were a lot of ideologies perpetrated by philosophers and scientists. I'm putting these in air quotes because I think to do those things you have to have some better ethics, but that would explain why it was spiritually, philosophically, and medically correct that those people be enslaved or not have
yeah.
their land. And Mullins does confront that a lot in decolonizing therapy,
Mhm.
including very much how psychologists and therapists have been a part of this whole colonial project and have contributed to the research and action to kind of to indoctrinate people, to erase their identities, to, violently enslave them.
There's a couple of things you just brought up that really resonate with me. When you were talking about colonization still being something that we do today,
Mm.
um, I've been reading a book called You Are the Medicine from Asha Frost, and we
Mm.
can put it in our notes down below. She talks about how there's colonization even within practices that white people are taking now on social media to make it look like they're new age spiritual. She
Mm.
was like taking sage and saging your home, which was actually a practice that was denied from indigenous peoples for a long time. Or using dream catchers, talking about spirit animals, some things that are very sacred to one culture, one group of people that we then take and make our own and make it white. And so I was thinking about this is still ongoing, and we may be perpetrators of that. And to recognize that with grace for everyone involved. I was really thinking about this isn't a past project, as you were saying, and I really resonated with that. The more I'm reading about this, the more I'm engaging with this topic, the more I'm realizing this is entrenched to have parts of your culture now appropriated. At first, you weren't allowed to have it, and now we're going to take it and make it trendy. And so that just really resonated.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to acknowledge. I appreciate you saying that. That's another way this is just ongoing. And we're going to talk about some specifics with that later on too, about how this shows up in psychology and therapy spaces. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
The other thing that really resonated with me was when you said everyone's impacted.
Mm,
Personally, it has been really interesting to be in other cultures. I've been able to live in Tokyo, Istanbul, and Edinburgh in my life and get to know different cultures, very vastly different from one another.
yeah.
One of the things that they all had in common was a sense of home and belonging
Mm,
in their culture. I was in Scotland during the referendum, um, and I've really reflected on myself here. I know that I'm from Norway and Ireland, and I have a little bit of Ukrainian in me. Those aren't places I would go and be able to meet up with relatives.
mm,
Based on my past, it's not like I know I'm from there, but they would never be considered my home. It gives me heritage, it doesn't give me belonging.
mm,
And yet I also am very well aware that I'm a settler on this land. And you have this very, or at least I should speak personally, I have a very displaced feeling when it comes to that word home.
mm,
Home can be my little place with my dog Maggie, home can be with friends, but home isn't land in a same way that I've been able to see dear friends of mine have that. And so when we have colonized generations down the line, you've also displaced those generations to not really have
mm.
a place that I get to go to Norway and rock up to my relative's place. I don't know who they are.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. And I think, kind of acknowledging some of the socioeconomic factors that came into colonization also meant that usually the powerful, it was always the powerful white men that were kind of enacting these grand plans, but then often it was the impoverished people from the European countries that were sometimes not really by choice, sometimes by economic necessity, sometimes by indentured servitude, were kind of forced to be a part of this whole colonial project. And of course, there were also powerful settlers that came and stayed, but think that that was one of the like, I don't know, tricks, so to speak, of colonization was pitting people of different skin colors against each other as a form of control for all of them.
Yeah.
And then that also, I think, was often a thing that was done to keep the settler colonial white folks kind of in place is like, oh, well, there's a rung below me. So I can
Mhm.
feel this sense of power. And then through feeling that power contribute to the problem even further than by just being a settler.
Yeah.
But then ultimately, those folks, exactly as you said, Jess, then have within a generation or two, are really going to lose that cultural
Mhm.
identity, and kind of have that kind of unmoored sense of self and family. And I share in that too. I'm a white European with, all kinds of different ancestry around Europe. But similar to you, like there's not a country in Europe that I could go to and say like, oh, here is my family, right?
Mhm.
My
Yeah.
dad's into some genealogy stuff, so like I even know like towns where people came from, but still,
Yeah.
I don't know any of them. That's not
Yeah.
my culture per se, and I think that's been one of the big concerns that I've seen within the decolonial sphere is a fundamental problem that colonization introduces is the creation of white and European as quote normal.
Yes.
That's normal. Everything else needs definition, description, control. But here's normal. And actually, normal's not really an identity.
No.
It leaves you with nothing. And I do think it's important for um, any clients we're working with, but this can be important working with white clients, is like helping them discover what they are besides neutral, what their kind of identities and understandings are. Um, because I think that can be a lot of the backlash of like this, like, oh, okay, so I'm not allowed to have anything. When it comes to things like appropriation, it's like, no, you need to have your own thing, and figure out what that is. And colonization has really done us no favors
No.
in setting us up to know who we are and what we're about.
I think that that's excellent. And that point of kind of aspect of like, what does that pitting against do? And that excellent book, White Fragility, comes
Mm,
to mind when you're talking about that because there's also this inherent defensiveness, selfishness, or fear. I would actually say fear of how do I talk about this when I'm part of the problem? And a lot of my clients, when they were talking about white fragility, would talk about this fear that they have or feeling implicated in something. And a lot of my job was to say, you are. You are implicated. Let's talk about this. And let's not use this kind of fear and defensiveness to shut down a conversation, but to maybe
mm,
have it be the start of something, to
mm,
have it be the start of your own understanding, your own discovery, your own research. Don't use your BIPOC friends to do the work for you. Do it
mm,
yourself. Let's do this together. Um, because I think that even within our field, there's so much of our field that is very white and can be incredibly. We've struggled against the confines of this, you and I. We started this podcast because we were struggling against the confines of this, of very black and white thinking. Therapist is superior to client. We have it all sorted out, client doesn't. And
mhm,
constantly seeing this as perpetuating a stigma that if you have mental health struggles, that you are broken. And seeing that with certain modalities that there's a six-part step to make you fixed. And
mm,
we hated that because we could constantly see this ceiling that was hurting people, that was missing the complexity of their stories.
mhm. And I think when we talk about therapy being colonized, needing to be decolonized, there's that same kind of history of powerful white European men are the origin of therapy, and then it was just kind of employed on top of other cultures, brought into the medical model, used violently at times as a form of control and coercion, like we mentioned before. Um, and I think a lot of that is just the need to acknowledge that therapy, the way that it's done in the West and its origins are erasing other historical forms of healing, right? Every culture has had approaches and methods to healing and support and getting wisdom and guidance from others. Um, but they will have a framework that matches their other cultural components. Something that we'll talk about more later that some of our quotes are around is about a more communal cultures that are not so hyper individualistic like white European colonization is. So that can kind of be one thing that we'll look at, like how could we build a mental health system or mental health practices that are more intentionally focused on meeting different cultural needs, meeting clients where they're at. Um, and also considering is our whole idea of sit down talk therapy with a bunch of rules and kind of strictures the right fit for everyone.
Yeah. And Zahara, one of our people, is really excellent at kind of at naming that. And when we get to solutions, we'll totally get to bring her up. Sitting in the problem right now, I think one of our colleagues, Gina Lihu, said this really, really well. Gina identifies as a Black woman of color with Jamaican heritage. So for her, this topic is very prescient. And for her, she said, when we talk about decolonizing therapy, we're talking about recognizing that most of the frameworks we use in mental health, from CBT to psychodynamic to humanistic models, were built through the Western Eurocentric lens. These models tend to assume that the individual is the main focus, that independence equals health, and that distress is something located inside the person. And then she writes, but for many of us, especially people of color, immigrants, or those from collectivist cultures, our struggles and our healing are deeply connected to community, to family, and to the systems we move through. So when therapy ignores the impact of things like racism, migration stress, or cultural disconnection, it can unintentionally repeat the same colonial harm it's meant to help heal.
Really, I think, salient words from Gina that help to kind of capture some of the ways that therapy isn't quite meeting the needs right now, historically and in ongoing, even in modern training for how therapy is done. There's usually kind of a checkbox for like, oh, did you talk about, cultural differences or something? But still, it's the same model kind of cut and pasted on top of all these different types of interventions. And I think one of the big concerns for me is making sure that we have training that helps individuals to be prepared to talk about their identities and their clients' identities in a way that can recognize the impact of these things that Gina is naming: racism, migration stress, cultural disconnection, so that we are not making things worse, so to speak. Um, and we've a lot of more kind of detail that we're going to get into in just a minute here about what some of the specific concerns and troubles with colonized therapy are.
One of the things that I'm learning and have done wrong
Mm.
is how much I do value boundaries. And thinking about this aspect of toxicity within families. I've often prided myself on being able to allow us to think about keeping ourselves safe. And I miss the mark, and I'm learning my own blind spots on when is that appropriate and when is that not.
Mm.
Because one of the things Gina said was that many therapists are trained and encouraged to help clients set strong boundaries and to cut off toxic family members. And one of the things she said that really hit me was, but for some cultures, those relationships, even when complicated, are tied to identity, belonging, and survival. Suggesting disconnection can feel like asking someone to cut away a piece of who they are. Wow. When I read that, I felt like an extraordinary learning was about to happen for me, or like that, like this is an
Mm.
opportunity just to like recognize that some of the very things that I pride myself on, even when I'm trying to break away from colonization of therapy, is still colonial in its individualism.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it's a really meaningful quote and so kind of well articulated. I think that it just right there and not that many words hits home. And I've definitely made that kind of mistake before. It's something that is like in my inner dialogue that I would often be holding back in sessions. And I think we've talked about this some in other episodes as well, but there's like I might find relief in the idea that my client is never going to talk to their, quote, toxic family member again, but that's probably just something to keep to myself. That's a huge decision for anyone from any culture to make that I would discourage any therapist from ever saying you need to cut this person out of your life. This is not our decision to make. And exactly as you and Gina are saying here, like um, it's not always going to be culturally correct. And I have
Mhm.
worked with a number of clients who, in talking about their struggles with family, that maybe there's conflict, maybe they feel hurt by their family for various reasons, maybe they have, other identities too that are in conflict with some of their cultural identities. Like someone is maybe queer and from a traditional Hindu background. Things like that have come up, but even still, they'll say, Ryan, I can't. It just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like me to cut these people out, even though it has crossed my mind. And even though I see these like posts and read these books about people, cutting out their families. So I think it's really important for us to be able to bear the discomfort of not using our solution for
Yeah,
someone else's problem.
absolutely. Absolutely. And being able to look at that complexity and see it is so important.
Mhm.
And I think that's the balance. Celebrating with somebody when they need that celebration and support, because
Mhm.
that's a huge decision, and sitting with the tension of wanting, maybe considering, and also realizing this is my identity, this is who I am, and this is my culture, and
Mhm.
respecting that and becoming creative within that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's a good example for us to think about how something that is very tip of the tongue for Western psychology and Western kind of quote wellness or healing journeys or whatever is not culturally appropriate in many cases. And that's where that colonization of like, oh, here's the solution for everyone is a problem.
Yeah.
And our cultural practices, in a way that white Western um, approaches don't honor, are actually a part of how our minds and bodies are built, how they work, how we respond to things. One of the practitioners that we asked about their thoughts on decolonizing therapy, Monica Lau, shared with us that she sees nervous systems reflecting culture. And so orienting towards independence can feel threatening to a nervous system that is built around a more collectivist approach, making it difficult to engage in therapy if we push towards individuality as Western culture tends to do. So allowing the knowledge that our clients who have a more collectivistic culture also define their self and understand their world through those collective relationships. They can't just be cut out and divorced from them. So we really noticed when we were looking at the different voices that got back to us about what they would like to share about decolonizing therapy was there were these kind of connections and themes between different folks. So we were hearing both from Gina and Monica at this point, as well as Mullen in the book, that individualism is a big challenge that comes up with colonized therapy and doesn't mesh well for a lot of other cultures.
Yeah. Monica identifies as a second generation Chinese Canadian, and she works as a psychotherapist here at Centered Self. And there were real themes, actually, I think, in voices that aren't always heard, and that is in the silence. I think even when we think we're doing it well, it's always important to kind of see where are my blind spots. Because if you were trained in North America, dimes to donuts, you've had a Western understanding of psychotherapy. Even you and I, we both decided to do our doctorates in Scotland.
Hmm.
Still Western, still
Very.
within frameworks, still taught within object relations, which is the more kind of British understanding of how to do psychodynamic therapy, can have a little bit more openness to understanding our psyche and our motivations, still individualized. And so it's incredibly important. And one of the things that Mullen was saying in her book is also about our fear that psychotherapists can actually, we don't know what to bring up. We can almost fear bringing it up. We don't, I think there's such a fear around us getting it wrong that we get it wrong by our silence.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that kind of leads to another reflection from Gina Lihu about how therapists have that fear. It becomes a problem, but clients also fear that. Clients fear sharing that with their therapists. And so
Mhm.
that's another place where the colonized therapist can become a problem. So the client having that fear, Gina says, the fear isn't unfounded. Because when a person of color brings up race, many white therapists often unconsciously become defensive. They may start questioning the client's reality or turn it into a cognitive exercise. For example, using CBT, a therapist may ask, could it be that you're seeing things through a negative thinking filter? And right there, a rupture happens because the client isn't being met in their truth, they're being analyzed through a lens that doesn't hold their lived experience. So, what might feel like a rational challenge to the therapist can feel like gaslighting to the client. This
Hmm.
is what Gina calls the double burden. The client comes to therapy hoping to be understood, but instead they end up doing two jobs, explaining their pain and educating the therapist about racism and systemic barriers. And that's exhausting, and it's not their responsibility.
Absolutely brilliant. I think what she nailed there is that dynamic between client fearing this and having to do so much heavy lifting that they probably have to do every single day to be met. And
Mhm.
therapy is the one space where we try so hard to be right there with our client. There are modalities that silence the relationship between client and counselor because we're not educated, because we're fearful, because we don't want to seem racist. But
Mhm.
asking about a racialized experience can be one of the most holding things for a client. And I'm thinking about this in terms of therapist fears often with bringing anything up that they are scared about, right? We talked about this recently with suicide, that
Mhm.
you're not going to make somebody suicidal by asking about it. You're not racist by asking somebody about this or taking it seriously. And by doing that, you might be one of the first people that can actually meet your client and see them and hold them.
Mhm.
And your own defensiveness can get in the way of that.
Yep. And there's a lot of the more recent literature in kind of decolonizing therapy talks about broaching, which is just a term for introducing the topic that talks about the kind of the fear that you're naming there, Jess, of the therapist bringing up race. Like, oh, I'm gonna bring this up, I'm gonna make this a thing. Part of what this whole project of decolonizing therapy is saying is it's already a thing. You don't have
Yes.
to mention it for it to have happened and have been continuing to impact you and your clients.
Yes.
Um, so, getting comfortable with that conversation. And actually, I love Jess that used that example from the suicidality episode, to kind of say, um, bring it up. You're not creating it. And our own fear is preventing people from sharing their needs, sharing their truth, in a way that is maybe making that burden. So that's maybe one thing that therapists can do to relieve some of the double burden that Gina is naming is not making them be the one to broach.
Mm.
Taking that responsibility on as the professional, especially as the white professional.
You know what's interesting is that I think that a lot of times, even clients don't always realize sometimes how cultures come into it. With us trying to fit in, especially within this colonized country that I live in Canada, and for sure in the United States and elsewhere, there's probably an aspect of trying to fit in so much that we almost hide our own identities. And it can be really helpful to be able to, as a therapist, bring it into the room. I've noticed for myself that when I'm able to talk to clients or even ask about how does your culture, how does your skin color come into this feeling of shame or feeling of wanting to fit in, it's so many have said this is the first time they've actually had that question asked. And so I think that there's a real ability for us to be able to actually start to offer that space for them, which I know we're going to get into actually when we start talking about what we can do as therapists to decolonize. And because we are notoriously have so much to say about this topic, I think we need a part two. I think we could actually cap it here
Mm,
potentially and maybe do a part two where we then start to actually bring in what do we do about this. How does that sound, Ryan?
that sounds really good. Yeah, we can start next week, maybe cover a few more examples of places we see colonization show up in therapy room and in our practices. And then the bulk maybe of next episode, yeah, will be about what are we going to do about it? What are some thoughts and ideas about how to approach differently? How to decolonize, to finally get to the D part of this colonization related little two-parter.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening today. And stick with us next time when we actually try to decolonize therapy.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.